Hello everybody, my name is Dana Mackenzie, and I've been invited by Jesse Cry and Josh Friedel to come on chesslecture.com and show you an opening variation that I've been working on for the last 2 years. Recently I had a chance to play this variation in a big tournament for the first time, after 2 years of practicing it and perfecting it against the computer. So this tournament was the big coming out party for my new variation. You can't read about this in any book yet. The only place you can learn about it is right here on chesslecture.com. In the game I'm about to show you, I'm playing the white pieces, and black is David Proust, a young, up-and-coming international master who lives in the San Francisco area. This was the last round of the Western States Open in Reno, Nevada, this October, and there was a lot riding on the game, at least for me. I needed at least a draw to clinch a prize for the top under 2300 player. I've called this lecture Nuke the Sicilian because it involves hitting your opponent with a very early queen sacrifice, the biggest weapon in chess. I think it's fair to say that everybody who watched the game was astonished that you can sacrifice the queen so early in the game and get away with it. In fact, I think white does more than get away with it. I believe white gets full compensation and then some. It's a really exciting variation to play, and it's totally unexplored. So I hope that some of you will try it in your own games. Let me just say one more thing before we get started. It's very easy for black to avoid this queen sacrifice if he wants, and I think you'll find that most of your human opponents will. That's why I had to wait for 2 years to play it in the tournament. So that's the bad news. The good news, though, is that this is a very effective weapon against computer chess programs. If you own a copy of Fritz 9, for example, it will fall into this sacrifice every time. I've beaten Fritz with this queen sacrifice myself, and that's really saying something because it outrates me by about 800 points, given that its strength is supposed to be about 3,000. Perhaps in a future lecture I can show you some of my games against Fritz. All right, now let's get started and nuke the Sicilian. White's first move is e4, and black replies c5, the Sicilian defense. My next move is f4. This enters a variation called the Grand Prix Sicilian that was popular in the 1980s and kind of lost favor because of black's next move. Okay, black replies d5. This is a very dynamic response that was advocated by former world champion Mikhail Tal. Tal's idea actually involves a pawn sacrifice for black. If white captures on on d5, then black does not recapture right away with the queen. Instead, he plays knight f6. With this move, he's hoping to provoke white into protecting the pawn with c4, and at that point, black would reply with e6, setting up a true gambit. If white takes the e-pawn, then black will recapture with the bishop and have already a two-piece lead in development, plus white has a very weak backwards d-pawn. And Grandmaster practice showed that black has adequate compensation, and maybe even more than adequate in this variation. So as a result, white's move f4 really lost favor among strong players. In our game, David did play d5. So my thinking in this line is, why let black have all the fun when white can have the fun? Instead of letting black sacrifice a pawn, I'm going to sacrifice a pawn by playing knight to f3. This move actually sets up a sort of reversed Budapest gambit. If any of you are familiar with your d-pawn openings, this is exactly like the position that arises after d4, knight f6, c5, and e5, the Budapest gambit. In this case, colors are reversed, so white has an extra tempo, which he spent on the move f2 to f4. And so the big question is this a useful move for white, or is it a waste of time? Is it a weakening move? And I think it's a fascinating question. You'll see kind of both aspects of that in this game. Of course, I think that it's a good move. Anyway, David took the pawn, d takes e, and I move my knight to g5, attacking the pawn. Okay, and this is again very much in the style of the Budapest Gambit. David defends with knight f6, and now things get interesting. Okay, I play the move bishop to c4. Now, I suspect that just about all of you can see what white is trying to do. The bishop and the knight are focusing in on f7, threatening a very nasty check. So you're probably tempted to play e6 here, and I think that's probably what most humans would play in this position. But there is something else going on here. Remember that the move f4 weakened white's king side, and so by playing bishop to g4, black can attack white's queen. Now, this is a pretty big threat, and it's possible that your opponents, if you get into this variation, will be expecting you to play bishop to e2 in order to avoid losing your queen. But here's where we get to the queen sacrifice. Instead of playing bishop e2, white takes the bishop with his queen, sacrificing the queen on move 6. I think it's fair to say that all the people who were watching the game thought I'd lost my mind at this point, but actually, as I said, this is a variation I've been practicing for 2 years, and I'll explain a little bit more later about the thinking behind it. Well, obviously black has to take the queen, otherwise he's just a piece down. Okay. And now I continue, bishop takes f7 check. Black's move is forced, king to d7. Then I play bishop to e6 check. Now at this point, black has a choice of 3 different moves. One possibility is just to go back to e8, where he came from. Now, the drawback of this move for black is that white can immediately draw if he wants to, simply by playing bishop to f7 check, and then king back to d7, bishop e6 check, and so forth. So if black's happy with the draw and white's happy with the draw, that's the way the game would end. In fact, in this game, if David had played king to e8, I would have settled for the draw by repetition, because, as I've said, due to my position in the tournament, all I really needed was a draw in this game to clinch a pretty big money prize. However, under ordinary circumstances, I probably would have kept on playing. So backing up, after king e8, of course, white can play bishop takes g4, and play would proceed in fairly similar fashion to the game that we're going to see, where white sacrificed a queen for 2 pieces. I believe, as I said, I believe that white has full compensation for the material in the other lines. In this line, I'm not sure, because I haven't had the chance to play it very many times. Actually, haven't had the chance to play it at all, because the computer never plays king to e8. The computer wants to win. So if you get to this position, definitely try the queen sack, and let me know what happens. Okay, let's back up again. Okay, so after bishop takes f7 check, king to d7, and bishop e6 check, second possibility for black is to play king c7. Now, I don't think your human opponents will play this move very often. The reason is pretty simple. After bishop takes g4, white already threatens a fork, knight to e6 check, forking the king and queen. That means black has to take an additional move out to defend the threat, for example, by queen to e8, and then that allows white's knight to come in on e6 with a check, and white already has very good bind in this position. The knight, in particular, keeps the bishop, the king bishop, from developing normally, and it really cuts black's position right into 2. So white's compensation here is pretty obvious. Nevertheless, this is the favored variation that Fritz plays. So if you play this line against a computer, you do need to be prepared against king to c7. And again, if it's possible that we could explore this variation in a future lecture. However, let's go back and see the variation that David actually played. Okay, so we've just gotten to bishop e6 check, and David played what I would expect most humans to play in this position, which is king to c6. All right, now, of course, white's move is forced. He plays bishop takes g4. And so here we have what I think of as really the main position of this queen sack variation. Now, before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about the philosophy underlying this variation. To me, it's not just a variation. It's actually an entire concept. And there are several aspects, several parts of this concept. In fact, I'd say there are 5 principles that you need to understand to play this position correctly. And once you understand these principles, it'll be very easy for white to play the game, as you'll see. I'll point out the principles over and over throughout the game. First principle is active pieces. That's where white's compensation is coming from. If you look at this position, you say white has only 2 pieces for a queen, a bishop and a knight. That's not supposed to be enough material compensation. I think that's what amazed all the spectators. How can white play on with just 2 pieces for a queen? The key is that white has very active pieces, and that gives them more power than they would normally have. So these 2 pieces actually take on the power of 3 in some cases. So it's very important to keep the pieces active, develop all of the pieces, and coordinate the pieces. And I'm going to be pointing out over and over in this game where that sort of piece development and piece coordination occurs. It's very important to understand that that is white's objective in this opening. Second principle is restraint. Okay, black has a queen, white doesn't. Okay, the queen, as you all know, is a very powerful piece. And so white has to keep that queen under lock and key. Okay, you have to restrain the queen, keep it from penetrating into white's position. This is something I've learned over and over again by playing against Fritz, primarily, and also the computer program Crafty. When I let the queen get too active, I lose. So I learned my lesson the hard way, that you have to keep the queen in check in order to, well, when I say keep it in check, keep it from becoming too active, or else you're going to die. Third principle is closed lines. Now this is really counterintuitive. Usually when you sacrifice material, your first thought is open lines, attack the king, try to blow him out of the water. That's actually not the idea here. It's true that black's king is exposed and vulnerable, but white wants to keep lines closed because open lines, especially open files, will favor black's rooks. If black can get open files for his rooks and for his queen, he's basically got 3 straight moving pieces against white's 2. And he's going to outnumber white. So if there are any open files, white is going to be in trouble. So what you're going to see in this game is that I'm going to avoid opening files whenever possible. And you're going to see black's rooks turn into absolute bystanders. They have nothing to do. It's impossible for David to find any useful moves with his rooks. So that's a very key aspect of this position. Now, white is happy to open diagonals because, as you see, white has the bishops. And so open diagonals are great, but open files are not. Okay, so principle number 3 of playing the game, keep files closed if at all possible. At some point, it may be necessary to open a file, but at least as a general rule, you want to avoid too much of that. Fourth principle, don't cash in too early. Now, this is again something that's very hard and that I had to learn through experience. It's very tempting for white to try to win back his material because he's effectively down a piece. He wants to get some of this material back. So you'll see, right away, white's threatening a fork at f7, forking the queen and rook. Don't do it. Okay, if you do that fork, you're going to waste 3 tempi, taking the rook and then maybe trying to extract your knight from h8. Okay, you want to stick with your basic game plan of developing your pieces, getting active pieces, coordinating the pieces, and restraining black's pieces. Going after the material prematurely is not the game plan. Okay, so resist the temptation to grab material too early. The one exception to that is white does want to win the pawn on e4 as quickly as possible, because that pawn is a cramping piece. It cramps white's position, and prevents his development. Okay, so white will take that pawn as soon as he gets a chance to. And in fact, in some lines, although not in this game, I'm actually willing to sacrifice a pawn and play d3, and allow black to trade. It's actually not a sacrifice, but it's just not winning the pawn. But anything to get rid of that pawn on e4. Okay, so that's the fourth principle. And finally, the last principle is fairly subtle, but if possible, white wants to trade a knight for a bishop, one of his knights for black's remaining bishop. Why is that? Okay, the reason is that at that point, white will have two bishops against a queen. The two bishops will be unopposed by any black bishop, and that makes them an unbelievably strong fighting force. In fact, Hans Berliner, who is a former world correspondence chess champion, has said that he believes that two bishops plus two pawns are full compensation materially for a queen. So even though it looks as if white is still a pawn behind, it's not true. Okay, so getting the two bishops is, well, perhaps I have the two bishops, but eliminating black's bishops so that I have two unopposed bishops is an important part of white's game plan as well. So we've got those 5 ingredients to the game plan. Active pieces, restraining black's queen, keeping files closed so that black's rooks will have nothing to do. Don't cash in on your material too quickly. And finally, try to get black's bishop so that you have two bishops against the queen. Those are the 5 principles of playing this variation. And if you follow those principles, as I said, it's going to be easy to play the moves and you'll get a great game. You just need to follow the principles and don't rush. Okay, now let's carry on with the game. So after bishop takes g4, black has a lot of possibilities. He could go, for example, queen to d4. That's a very aggressive move that the computer crafty likes to play. Or he could go queen to d6. That's what some of my blitz partners like to do. Or there are other possibilities. One very important possibility to go over is actually, it's a trap that you should definitely know about if you're going to play this variation. One of black's most natural moves is to play e5. This looks like a really strong move. Black is getting ready to develop his pieces. He's undermining white's center, attacking the f-pawn, and white can't take the e-pawn because he loses his knight. Now, if white moves the knight to f7, which is actually, in this position, the correct move, it looks as if black is going to win a piece by playing queen to h4 check. White plays g3 to defend the check. Black takes the piece. Seems great, right? Well, there's one catch. Knight takes pawn check, forks the king and queen, and white will emerge a piece ahead. This trap actually happened in the first tournament game I ever played with this variation, and at this point my opponent resigned. He was a Class B player, so you can obviously catch some pretty good people in this trap. So, and I would say this is a beautiful example of what I was talking about with piece coordination. White's pieces do more than it seems as if they should. That knight, when it moved to f7, it wasn't just protecting or attacking the queen and the rook, it was also actually protecting the bishop. So this is a great line to know about, first because it might happen in your games, and second because it illustrates one of the main themes of the opening. Okay, so let's back up. Okay. All right, David actually saw that trap, and so he didn't play e5. Instead, he played e6, which is actually, I think, the best move in this position. And it's the move that Fritz, the computer program, generally plays. The idea is simple. Black is trying to develop his bishop. He saw that e5 was not safe, and so he plays e6 instead. Notice that white cannot take on e6 with the knight, because then queen h4 check really would win a piece, because white does not have the fork coming in at the end. Now, I could take the pawn with my bishop, but that would not fit in with my strategy. Okay, remember what I said before. Don't cash in too soon. White does not want to overextend himself in this opening, and taking the e6 pawn would actually open himself up to a little bit too much counterplay on black's part. What white does want to do is win the e4 pawn. Okay, I do want to win that pawn. The e6 pawn will remain weak for a very, very long time. I may be able to win it 10, 20 moves from now. So let's just leave it there. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is play knight c3, basically attacking the pawn on e4 a second time. I didn't want to take e4 right away because I like my knight on g5, so instead I'm developing my queen knight, and I'm going to use it to take the pawn on e4. Okay, black continues knight to a6. Now, this is kind of an interesting point in the game. David took 34 minutes on this move, an incredibly long think, and I would say it's a far from obvious move. I think most players would probably play bishop to d6 or perhaps knight to d7 here. Knight a6 is actually the best move. It threatens to come into b4, and then black would be threatening knight takes c2 check, forking the king and rook. Now, what I've learned from experience is that this gives black too much activity. I don't want it to happen. David was kind of unlucky because Fritz plays knight a6, the computer program plays knight a6 every time, and so I was prepared against this move. I played a3. Okay, so let me just back up. Right, a3. Now, Jesse Cry, when he saw this move, said that he thought this should get 2 exclamation points, because you wouldn't think that white, having sacrificed material, would have time to play a simple defensive move like this. But there's much more to it than meets the eye. Later on in the game, you'll see that this move supports an advanced b4, which chips away at black's pawns in the center. Okay. And the other key point is, as I said before, white has all the time in the world in this opening. It's unbelievable. You wouldn't think so. But black simply cannot get any serious threats going. So white just restrains black's pieces, keeps them from getting active, and eventually white's pieces will take over the board, as you'll see. Okay, so after a3, David played bishop to d6. Again, simple development. That's what I expected. And then I castled. Again, simple development for white as well. Okay. Now, there was an interesting point here. I was a little bit worried about bishop takes f4, because if I play rook takes bishop, black will play queen takes knight. However, there's nothing to worry about because white has a very strong move, knight takes e6. And you can see how glad we are we didn't take that pawn earlier with the bishop, because it's much better to have the knight there. The knight forks the queen and bishop, okay, and so white is going to win back another piece, and he'll have 3 pieces for the queen. Plus, he continues to have the advantages of active piece development, and black's king is exposed. So white has a clear advantage in this position. Well, again, David didn't go for that. He played simply and safely with knight to c7. He's making no mistakes here that I can see. Okay, he's playing very solid chess, defending his pawn on e6. And naturally, I take the pawn on e4, because at this point I want to get my queen side developed with d3 and so forth. Now, I should also point out here that white is finally threatening to play knight to f7, because that not only forks the queen and the rook, it also would win the bishop, which would be attacked twice by white's knights. So at this point, the fork threat is really getting serious. Now, I think another point that amazed the people who watched this game is that fork threat on f7 has been sitting there for 7 moves, and white's never done it. White's just let it sit there like a sword of Damocles above black's head. But, you know, eventually black has got to do something about it, so he decides to do something about it right here, and he plays queen to c7. Queen to e7, my fault. Okay, now we come to principle 5 of the 5 principles that I mentioned earlier. One of the key points in White's strategy is that he wants to exchange off Black's bishop. So that's what I did here. White takes the bishop on d6, and Black recaptures with the queen. So White's now fulfilled one of his objectives. He now has 2 bishops unopposed against the queen. Okay, so White is bit by bit accomplishing all of his objectives. Now, once again, I could play knight to f7, forking the queen and rook. But remember what I said, don't cash in too soon. The strategy here is just to get my pieces out, make them active, keep them coordinated, and going after the rook on h8 is not part of the plan. So here I played d3, continuing to develop. David plays rook to f8, which defends against the fork. And also, I would point out, David is trying to get some activity for his rooks. If possible, he would like to open the f-file, because that's where White would be vulnerable. So he's putting his rook on the f-file, possibly anticipating eventually playing either e5 or g5 to trade off that f-pawn. Okay, now here is an interesting spot. A lot of people ask me after the game, why didn't I play bishop to e3, which looks like the logical and natural move in this position. And it is, in fact, playable. But here's why I didn't play it. Okay. Black can reply with knight to d5, which hits the bishop on e3 and also hits the pawn on f4. Now, remember, I just said it's an important part of White's strategy to have the 2 bishops. So White does not want Black to take that bishop. And so why should I allow knight to d5, forcing me to move my bishop again? Now, if I move my bishop, then Black is going to win my f-pawn, which accomplishes another thing that I should not let Black accomplish. Namely, he would then have an open f-file. So allowing this move would actually violate two of the concepts that I mentioned behind this variation. So I actually did not really think very hard about this possibility at all. Now, David did think hard about it, and he looked at rook to e1, knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, queen to d4, pinning the rook, rook to e1, defending, and now Black can play simply queen takes b2. Now, it looks as if White has a threatening attack against Black's king, but in fact, Black is better in this position. And I've learned this through playing the computer many times, once that queen starts chomping up on White's pawns, the game is going south for White. Now, I might get a few checks on the king, I might even win a couple of kingside pawns, but the computer actually evaluates this position as in Black's favor by about 0.8 pawns, and I see no reason to disagree with it. So this is just not a variation that I wanted to play. From my experience, it's not looking good for White. All right, so it is actually, bishop e3 is a playable move, but only if, after knight to d5, White plays bishop to f3, pinning the knight. Okay. Then Black is forced to retreat his king, for example, to c7, and White would play knight to d5, forking the queen and pawn. Now notice the timely and active play of White's pieces, which is keeping Black on the defensive. And basically, after Black moves the queen, White is going to win the c-pawn. And at that point, Black would take the f-pawn. And we'd have a complicated position that the computer evaluates as being equal. So that's the way it could have gone. But as I said, I just did not really trust that way of playing it. So instead, what I did here was bishop f3 check. Okay. Now, of course, if knight to d5, White will win the pinned knight with c4. So Black retreats his king to d7. Now again, I could play bishop e3, but I was still reluctant to do that because of knight to d5. Instead, I played another calm, restraining move, c3. The idea of this move, of course, is to keep black's queen from going to d4 with check. Also, notice that if the queen takes the d-pawn, white would play rook to d1, pinning the queen against the king, and thereby winning back his sacrificed material and more. Another pretty example of piece coordination. Well, of course, that was not too hard for David to see, so he didn't play that. Instead, he plays knight to d5. And, of course, I'm perfectly happy to have the knight go to d5 as long as it's not hitting my bishop. So I played g3, defending the f-pawn. Again, notice the theme, keeping the files closed. I don't want him to win the f-pawn. I don't want him to open the f-file. Again, I think that the spectators were amazed that white can take the time for these moves. Surely white can't have the time to play moves like c3, g3, Surely white should be attacking. Well, you just have to hold back. Okay, we're just keeping everything under control, and white's turn will come, believe me. Okay. David plays h6, chasing the knight away. I play knight to e4. All right, the knight hits the queen. Queen's got to move. David moves it to queen to c7. And now I played b4. At this point, the tide of the game starts to turn. White starts to take the initiative over. And in fact, this is really the point where I felt certain that I was getting an advantage. White is going to basically knock out black's center, and once there aren't any pawns in the center, black's king is just going to be naked, and white is going to just roll his pawns forward. Now, at this point, David made a slight error. Okay, in the post-mortem analysis, we concluded that b6 would have been the best move for him, just to defend the c-pawn and to try to keep some stake in the center. Okay. Instead, what David played was sort of the more obvious move, pawn takes pawn, and I go pawn takes pawn. Okay. Now, notice that I'm offering my c-pawn here, but if he takes it, I would play knight to c5 check. And white has just a dominating position. This is a beautiful example of the piece coordination. The knight attacks the pawn on e6, which would allow him to fork the queen and rook. The knight and bishop both attack the pawn on b7, and the rook attacks the pawn on a7. So these three pieces combined are just going to invade black's position, leaving black essentially defenseless. So David, of course, did not like the look of that at all. And so instead, he plays b6, which defends the a-pawn. Okay. I played bishop to d7, bishop to d2, finally getting my last piece out. Black plays rook to f7. I think here his plan, as I said, is eventually he wants to try to open the f-file. And so here he's trying to double rooks so that he can then perhaps play either e5 or g5. But he never gets time to do it because right away I attack his knight with c4. And the knight retreats to f6. And now I play bishop to c3. You can start seeing how this variation works. White's pieces are just gradually creeping forward, slowly but surely, and there's nothing that black can do to stop them. The two bishops especially are simply going to dominate the board. Now here, David makes what the computer says is his only serious mistake of the game. Okay? He should have played knight takes knight and bishop takes knight. But in this position, again, white has a tremendous game with the two bishops absolutely dominating the center. The bishop on c3 is going to go to e5. The pawn is going to march forward to d4 and d5, opening up the line against black's king. This position is going to be a nightmare for black, no matter how he plays it. Well, what David played instead of knight takes knight was king to e7. Okay. And the problem with this move is simply that after bishop to e5 and queen d7, white plays knight to d6, and now black has to contend with 3 pieces instead of 2. The 2 bishops and the knight are all converging on his king and overrunning his position. So black should have taken the chance to exchange the knight while he could, even though his position was still very unpromising. At this point, David says he felt his game was lost. And yet, materially, of course, it's still just 2 bishops against a queen. 2 bishops and a pawn against a queen. So this gives you really an idea of how powerful white's play is in this variation. Once he gets things under control, we kept things under control, kept restraining black, and now it's our turn to attack. Okay, now it's hard to say what black should do here. Black has no useful plans. And this is one comment that Josh Friedel actually made in his blog on the U.S. Chess Federation website, where you can actually also see this game. He said the position is just 100 times easier for white to play than black. And that's absolutely true. The moves just flow naturally for white, and if you stick to the principles I've told you about, it's almost obvious what to do on each move. Whereas black has to sit here and try to figure out, where am I going to get counterplay from, and do I want to move my rook away from the attack, or am I just going to ignore it, or what should I do here? Black has never played a position like this before in his life, whereas I've played this many times, as I said. So the odds are really pretty stacked against David, and I really have to give him credit for even going into this. Okay, now let's look at one amusing possibility here, which wasn't played, would be knight to e8, where black wants to challenge white's knight on d6. But that's refuted immediately by rook takes a7, and if queen takes a7, knight to c8 check, forking the king and queen. Another beautiful example of the incredible coordination among white's pieces. Well, David saw that one too, and he didn't fall into much of anything this game. He just ran into a bulldozer was basically what happened. So he plays rook to d8. Okay, he's saying, okay, let me let you have the rook, but I'm just going to try to activate my other rook. Actually, let me go back and point out one other thing he decided not to play. You might say, well, what about queen takes knight? Bishop takes queen, king takes bishop. Okay, here black is giving back the queen for the 2 pieces, hoping that will somehow free his game. But of course, he's already a pawn down here, and it gets worse. White can play rook to a6, rook to c8, and rook to a1, doubling on the a file. And now the only way for black to defend the a pawn would be to play rook c7, and then white crashes through with c5 check. And he's going to win a pawn on the queen side. He'll be 2 pawns up, and with still an incredibly powerful position. So there's no hope, no escape for black into an endgame, into a nice ending by giving his queen back for 2 pieces. He just has to sit and wait for whatever white has in mind. Okay, so again, let's go back to the real game. In the real game, David played rook to d8, and here I made my one inaccuracy of the game. Okay, well, nobody's perfect. And the funny thing is, I actually didn't follow my own advice. Remember I said, don't cash in too quickly. Well, I'm afraid I did. Okay, I was just too tempted by that rook, and also I was afraid that black might play king to f8 and then be able to sack his queen for the 2 pieces a little more effectively than he did in that last variation. So I decided to play knight takes rook right away. I probably should not have done that. There is no need to do it. Okay. In fact, white has perfectly good moves, ways to strengthen his position without committing himself yet. He can play d4, he could play b5, he could follow b5 with bishop to c6. All of these are tremendously powerful moves, and they don't allow black even a semblance of counterplay. So by taking the rook a little bit too soon, you'll see that I actually gave black a chance for some counterplay, And so it was a good lesson for me. I deviated from my strategy at one point, and it could have caused me some trouble. Anyway, so I took the rook. David took back with his king. King takes f7, and I played d4 to defend the d pawn and mobilize my pawns. Now, at this point in the post-mortem analysis, somebody asked, what would you have done if black had played b5? And actually, that's a very complicated move, and we weren't really able to get a definitive answer in the post-mortem. Okay. What I intended to do during the game was to play c5, establishing a protected passed pawn. But in that case, black would get an excellent square for his knight on d5, attacking the b pawn. This would definitely give black some counterplay. And interestingly, Fritz, the computer, says white's best response here would be rook to b1, simply protecting the pawn. Okay. Again, this is so much a piece of, part of this game that the white plays very calmly and just restrains black's pieces, not in any hurry. Okay, just defends the pawn. And what white wants to do next is to play rook to a6, double rooks on the a file, and then win the a pawn. Also, another idea after rook a6 might be to cross the rook over to d6. So, according to Fritz, the computer, black is almost forced to play queen to b7 to keep the rook out. But by doing this, he's walked into a pin. He's set up a pin on his own knight on d5, and now that means that the knight is no longer threatening b4, and white can calmly play rook to a3, followed by rook to a1, doubling rooks on the a file, and essentially continuing to ratchet up the pressure on black's position. Okay, well, that's very beautiful, and I wish I'd had Fritz during the game to advise me like that. I have no idea if I would have actually come up with that or not. But anyway, I'm lucky that David actually didn't play b5. He played king to g6. I asked him after the game, why did you play king to g6? And his response was interesting. He said, well, he felt he was lost already, and he said, I just wanted to confuse you. And so it actually worked, because I took about 15 minutes on my next move. So it did confuse me a little bit, but it's not really the best move. Anyway, I played g4. Basically, the idea here is to start setting up some vague mating threats against black's king. At least we're taking some squares away from him. And you'll see that the threats become a lot more concrete in a couple moves. Okay, here black plays rook to c8, and I played c5. Okay, again, establishing my beautiful passed pawn here. Now, at this point, it's too late for black to play knight to d5, because that would run into bishop e4 check, king f7, and then f5, which blows the position open. The threat, of course, is pawn takes pawn, discovered check, followed by bishop f5, which would win black's queen. So basically, black is dead here. And here also I would point out again, look at white's two bishops, the incredible power of those two bishops, looking both ways, looking towards the king side and the queen side. That's where the compensation is for white for his sacrificed queen. Okay, so let's back up. All right, so black does not have time for knight to d5. Instead, he plays queen to b5. So he's finally getting to activate his queen after all this time. But that's okay. I am finally prepared for it. I play rook takes a7. Now, here's a cute little point. You might think that black would just play queen takes b5, but actually that loses to a mate in 2. Bishop e4 check, knight takes bishop, and rook takes g7 checkmate. So again, we see the beautiful coordination of white's pieces, and also we saw the power of the two bishops here. Okay, so if we back up, David saw this, of course. He saw all of my tactical tricks in this game. Still didn't help him. So he saw that coming up, and instead he plays queen to d3. which is an excellent-looking move. He's really getting good active. His queen is really getting activity now, and you can see why it was so important for me to keep it out for so long, because white has to be able to respond to this sort of thing. Okay, now after queen d3, I played h4. This is a very sharp move. My threat is to play h5 check. That would chase black's king back to h7, and then I would win a piece with bishop takes knight. So to stop that, black is almost forced to play h5, and then I advance my pawn to g5. All right, now here's a pretty little point, and this is really the last little, I guess you could say perhaps the last trick for white in this game. It looks as if black might be able to play knight to g4, which would be a nice aggressive move, threatening to play queen to d2, followed by queen h2 checkmate. So black's knight and queen are a very dangerous attacking combination. And if white plays bishop takes knight, then the queen would come in with queen to g3 check, and now king to h1, queen takes pawn check, king to g2, queen takes bishop check, and white's king is very exposed. It's very likely that black is going to get a draw by perpetual check in here. So I definitely did not want to allow that to happen. Let's back up. Okay, so on knight to g4, bishop takes knight is bad. Now you might say, well, what about rook takes g7 check? Well, the trouble with that is now black's king has a flight square on f5. And so white doesn't really have anything better than just a repetition, a perpetual check, with rook f7 check and rook to g7 check. Now, a draw would have been okay for me, as I've said before, but by this point, I really want more than a draw, because I've been, controlling the game for so long, and it would be disappointing to settle for a draw in this position. Well, fortunately, there is a win for white after knight to g4. Whoops, let me go back to here. So, knight to g4. Okay, do you see what the winning move is? The key to think of is that flight square that black's king had on f5. So what white should play is f5 check. Now, if pawn takes f5, black has occupied his own flight square, and white checkmates him on g7. The same thing would happen if black takes with the queen, occupying the flight square. Now, if black takes with the king, now he walks into a humongous discovered check, bishop e2 check, which wins black's queen, and again would win the game. And finally, if the king retreats to h7, then rook takes pawn check, the king has to go back to h8, and then the final beautiful point, now bishop takes knight, and observe that the bishop on e5 now defends g3, so black cannot play queen to g3 check. Well, he can play queen g3 check, but he loses the queen, and in this position, white has an extra two pieces, a bunch of pawns. Forget it. This game is over. All right. So f5, just a wonderful move. I think a problem move, occupying the flight square and also clearing the diagonal for white to defend against black's main threat. Now, I don't know whether David saw that or not, but in any case, he played the simple, safe move, knight to e8. Okay. Now, of course, this defends the g-pawn, so rook takes g7 check is no longer a threat. But on the other hand, it now leaves the e4 square undefended. So I play king to g2, protecting the bishop, and now there's really nothing that black can do. If he moves his queen away from the diagonal, white is going to play bishop e4 checkmate. So he has to keep the queen on the diagonal. Okay. Instead, David played b5. I play rook to e1 with the threat of bishop e4 check, and it's all over. There's nothing black can do. Black played king to f5. I play bishop e4 check. He takes, I take, he takes. And 30 moves after sacrificing the queen, I finally won the queen back. And at this point, white has an easy win. He's 2 pawns up in the ending. And I'll just play through the final moves quickly in case you want to see how the game ended, but there's really not much more to be gotten from it. So I played rook a5, attacking the pawn. Black defends it with knight c7. I take the g-pawn. This sets up another passed pawn on the other side of the board. He took the f-pawn. I go back, bishop e5 check. This, incidentally, is the 40th move, so this was where the time control was. So after this point, I once again have all the time I want to think. He played king to g4. I push my pawn to g6. He takes, push the pawn to g7. He plays rook to g8. Actually, there's a cute little trap here. If I played bishop takes knight, he would play rook takes pawn check, forking my king and bishop, and then he'd actually have chances to draw the game. So I actually had to be on my toes a little bit. So instead of doing that, naturally I play rook to a7, attacking the knight. He plays knight to d5. I play rook to f7. You can see my plan is just to move to f8 and then queen the pawn. He plays knight check. I play king f3. He goes knight to g4. And there's one last little trap here. Okay, if I go rook to f8, he would play knight takes bishop, pawn takes knight, rook takes pawn, and again, he would have drawing chances here. But, of course, I saw that too, and did not play rook to f8. Instead, I simply played c6, and now there's nothing black can do. White is going to play c7, rook c8, and one of the 2 pawns is going to queen. So at this point, David resigned. Well, I thank you for looking at this game with me, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. To me, it was just an amazing thrill. It was almost like a fairy tale to work on an opening variation for 2 years, and all that time I dreamed of doing something exactly like this, of playing this variation against some titled player, an international master, a grandmaster, in a big tournament with money at stake, and winning the game, and amazing the spectators, and that's exactly what happened. It was really the thrill of a lifetime for me. So let me just say one other thing. Someone asked David after the game, well, why did you play bishop to g4, way back on move 5? Why did you allow this queen sacrifice? And he said something very interesting, something that I think is part of why he's such a good player. He said, I didn't want to be intimidated just because it looked as if my opponent had some threats. I'm not going to play anything less than the best move. And so he played bishop to g4, which he thought was the best move. How was he to know that 30 moves later I was going to get my material back? That's part of the chess competition and the competition of chess ideas. So now maybe he wouldn't do it, but I think it's really a testament to his courage and his fighting spirit that he played that. Without his being willing to do that, we wouldn't have had this beautiful game to look at. So, so I really thank David for his courage playing that move and for his good sportsmanship after the game. I think every chess game is a creation of 2 people, and so we have to recognize his role in this game. Anyway, thank you again for listening to my lecture, and if you play this variation, the Queen Sacrifice variation, I wish you great luck, and I hope that you can all tell me about your own wins and triumphs with this variation. Thanks.